I mean, think about this with me. Where would an ought even come from? Where would an ought come from on this view? From organisms that merely examine what is?
Now, Noah, you're not trying to slip in an argument from ignorance under the radar there, are you? I certainly hope not. But that does sound suspiciously like, where could oughts possibly come from? Oh, I don't know, therefore God. The question, where can oughts come from, certainly comes from ignorance. It can only be asked by a person who doesn't actually know where they come from. And you can really only not know where oughts come from if you don't know what an ought is. But since I've already explained that, it should be fairly obvious where oughts come from. In an ethical context, oughts arise out of our goals and primary values, whether we're consciously aware of these things or not. As I said, any ought is a statement of desire of how we want the world to be, how we want a given state of affairs to be. And it's fairly obvious that all such assertions and all such judgments arise out of a general teleological overview. The simple fact is, the mind is naturally teleological. These things are hardwired. When you actually analytically deconstruct any particular moral viewpoint or judgment, you can actually see that what it really is a logical judgment. It's a logical judgment made against or within the framework of a given goal or primary value. That's what oughts are. That's how they arise. There's nothing mysterious about them whatsoever. Now, when it comes to specific oughts and specific goals and values, the question of their origin is one for which we do not yet have a scientific answer. We can somewhat platitudinously say that they arise out of our nature, but of course we don't, as yet, have a complete understanding of what drives our nature. So from a scientific point of view, we don't really know as yet what produces particular oughts or goals and values in any given individual. We can guess at such things, but we don't really know for sure at this stage how these things develop. But philosophically, we can understand that all ethical oughts arise out of the things that I just mentioned. This is not a difficult thing to understand. It's not mysterious at all.
I mean, and then all of a sudden there's this, perception of what ought to be the case. I mean, mere existence, just the fact that you exist, or a formed concept of what is the case, cannot lead to what ought or what ought not be the case. See, ises are very different. Ises are a very different sort of thing than oughts.
And yet, every ought is an is. All oughts are ises. Oughts are facts of reality, like any other fact of reality. I have no idea why you want to insist on attributing some kind of mysterious character to their existence. It can only be self-serving because there's absolutely no reason to do so.
See, if there's oughts, then the universe has to sort of start with an ought for any of this to make sense. There's telos there.
No, there's made-up bullshit there. The universe doesn't have to start with anything. It only has to produce telos like it produces everything else, through simple processes of cause and effect. Telos and teleology generally emerge as attributes of consciousness, and that's the only place they exist.
If the universe begins with things that simply are the case, and then basically rearranges and alters according to natural laws that simply are the case, they aren't going to produce something that ought to be the case.
You see that chunk of wood over in the corner there? That is my Zen stick, and I am this close to reaching for it. Teleology, ethical oughts, are all things that are merely facts of reality. They themselves are things that simply are the case. What about that is difficult to understand? The natural processes of nature produce all of these things.
And if all you take to be real is the material world, then there is no way things ought to be.
Now, I'm sorry to be so candid with you here, but at this point, whether you realize it or not, you have actually descended into idiocy. That statement you just made is breathtakingly stupid. The philosophical ignorance involved in that statement is something that ought to embarrass you. And this is an intellectual error that you keep making time after time after time, even when it's pointed out to you, time after time after time. You keep thinking that if a certain thing isn't intrinsic to reality, if it isn't objectively and absolutely built into reality, that it cannot be at all, that it cannot manifest. This is absurd. The idea that ought can exist intrinsically in nature or in reality is simply incoherent. Completely incoherent. And to be honest with you, I'm loath to even bother to explain why. An ought can only be expressed from a perspective that has options. Reality doesn't have any frigging options. The concept of ought is inapplicable to reality itself. It can only emerge from within that reality, within the framework of subjective and relative perspectives. The relative and subjective oughts that we bring through our consciousness are in fact the only ones that can possibly exist.
What you're left with, on an atheistic accounting of this, is that the concept of better, like we've been using, on an atheistic view, turns out to be defined as something like statistically more successful. It enhances survival value or something along those lines. So normative content turns out to be nothing more than a statistical concept, and it carries absolutely no normative oughtness, no normative weight at all.
The real problem here is that your notions of normative weight and normative oughtness contain no reality. They don't speak to anything real. They are simply confabulations. There are two frameworks from within which these things arise, that of the individual and that of consensual agreement by a group of individuals. It means nothing to say that a point of view carries no weight when the scales you are using to measure it are imaginary.
What does it mean for me to say that the brakes on my car are dysfunctional? What does it mean to say that? If I claim that my brakes are dysfunctional, I'm essentially claiming they're not functioning the way they ought to function, right? And when I say that, I'm basically saying they're not functioning the way they were designed to function. So you see, if there's going to be a real difference between a good and bad set of brakes, there has to be a person or a designer that made there to be a particular way they ought to work, the way they're supposed to function. Likewise, if there is a genuine difference between good and bad behavior or good and bad reasoning, there has to be a designer who made things to function a certain way, from which we understand bad reasoning and bad behavior as a deviation from what ought to be. And a theistic view makes much more sense of this than a view of reality that says there is no God, for the reasons that I've just described.
I'm sorry, but the theistic point of view doesn't resolve these questions in the slightest. Like so many assertions of God as the answer to a question, all it does is create an extra complication. I don't know where you get the idea that God somehow resolves these issues. How is that possible? You've said we can't derive an ought from an is, so where the hell do we get oughts from? This must also be true of God. God cannot derive an ought from an is, so where does God get oughts from? The most common answer to that question is that oughts are an inherent and necessary part of God's nature. That is, God doesn't get them from anywhere. They're simply part of who he is. But again, that answer simply adds a complication that isn't necessary, because I can say that my oughts are part of my nature, and I can say it because it's obviously true. So I don't need your answer of God. I don't need your God to be the source of any of these things. Your God isn't an answer at all. It's simply a complication. Anyway, Noah, thanks for the interesting challenge, and thanks for watching, assuming that you did, and thank you for being tolerant, assuming you are, of my at times rather contemptuous attitude. Cheers, mate.